in strict compliance with the United Nations Charter and all of our commitments around the world.
Let's just talk about the precedent that has been set here and the type or the level of anxiety that is going to bring about in not only Latin American countries, but globally as well.
Now, what they did, you feel me, they didn't really have no jurisdiction to go to Venezuela, nor did they have approval for the UN. You feel me? I'm not in politics, so I don't really know, but you feel me? Just go take a random country and take their president to jail in another country, I think that's out of line.
Well, so there are two ways of, we're right now in the middle of so many lawless situations in the world. We are in the situation of a major invasion of Ukraine. We are seeing violations of international humanitarian law of the most extreme kind in Gaza. We are seeing a civil war in Sudan. There is renewed fighting in Myanmar. These are the conflicts that the world should be working on. We should be working to end those conflicts and to work on the existential problems of climate change, global health, and prosperity. Instead, President Trump is wasting money and his bully pulpit, his platform in the world to bring about solutions to these major problems by killing people lawlessly and invading a country. It's a demonstration of his love of drama. It is not solving US problems or world problems. We really are in an economic and military force mess around the world. This is an opportunity for the world to come together and insist that a leading country like the United States come back into compliance with the world's law. The best thing that can be done by governments around the world is to put pressure on the United States to reverse this lawlessness and return to a focus on the United Nations Charter and the international treaties and the very basis of world order, which is commitment to treaties.
I just wanted to pick you up on one point.
Whether it's President Trump or President Putin, believing that they are above the law. That is the essential message that governments everywhere need to send if they want to have some kind of order for the planning and prosperity of their countries.
I wanted to just pull you up on one thing that you said earlier.
That is really the essential.
Hello, can you hear me?
I'm trying to make right now, regardless of how things turn out in Venezuela.
Hi, can you hear me, Professor?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. I wanted to pick you up on one point that you made earlier about asking the United States to send Mr. Maduro and his wife back to Venezuela to stand trial, to face justice there in a way that is within international law and bloodless, etc., etc. The only slight issue with that is that the judiciary in Venezuela is completely co-opted by the Maduro government. So how would you suggest that would happen?
Well, here's a dilemma. Yes, Venezuela is in a very bad state. I have been a huge critic of Maduro since he took over and earlier of Chavez. Anytime that the courts are implicated and are corrupted by a government leader, this should bring the attention of all international lawyers around the world. But instead of doing that, the United States has chosen the path of lawlessness. So it's just as our courts would be corrupt to take on this case in which a person has been brought illegally into the United States to stand trial. So whether our courts, whether U.S. courts will violate the rule of law in holding Maduro accountable, or we send him back where it's likely his courts will also not, at this point in time, hold him accountable. This is a terrible dilemma. But I know that the United States needs to take the first step in getting back into compliance with the law.
Okay.
And then support a future trial within both Venezuela and the U.S. of Maduro.
Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell, expert in international law at Notre Dame Law School, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm going to bring you some images now from this morning from inside Caracas. These are still photographs taken from inside La Carlota military airbase. That's in Caracas, the Venezuelan capital. They show an anti-aircraft unit that's clearly been destroyed. You can also see what appears to be substantial damage done to a bus. La Carlota is an important military base. It's right in the heart of Caracas and was one of the targets struck during the early hours of this morning local time. We'll bring you more images as and when we get them. But Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has today said he wants to establish the facts of what happened in Venezuela and also wants to talk to President Trump later. Meanwhile, Russia called the strikes deeply concerning, while Germany has said it's watching the situation with what it called concern. Our World News correspondent Joe Inwood has more.
It's hard to overstate the significance of this moment. The strikes are the first the US has carried out in Latin America in more than 3 decades. If, as claimed, special forces have captured the Venezuelan president and his wife, it is an event without precedent. Nicolas Maduro has been in power since 2013, taking over from his mentor Hugo Chavez. He has become increasingly authoritarian, especially since retaining power in highly disputed elections. In recent months, Venezuelan forces have been on high alert, a response to the ramping up of pressure from the US. Details of the operation to capture him are still emerging, but it's being reported that Delta Force, an elite US unit, were involved.
So that's a very daring operation, but a key part of that, to me, Venezuela was on alert. Being able to seize the president, fly out, to some extent, it suggests that there was a degree of internal support for the US move, and we're certainly hearing some rumours at the moment that this was a negotiated exit. The question remains negotiated with whom in Venezuela, but that this was supported to some extent by people inside the country.
The closest historical comparison is the capture of Panamanian President Manuel Noriega on this very day in 1990, the last time the US intervened militarily in the region. Like Maduro, he too had been accused of drug trafficking and faced huge military pressure. But his capture, after an 11-day holdout in the Vatican embassy, was only achieved by a full-scale ground invasion. Venezuela's allies, including Russia, have condemned today's events, while even the US's closest partners have not openly welcomed it.
I want to establish the facts first. I want to speak to President Trump. I want to speak to allies. As I say, I can be absolutely clear that we were not involved in that. And as you know, I always say and believe we should all uphold international law. But I think at this stage, fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts.
There's still much we do not know about today's events, but what we can say is that the capture of a sitting president in this way is unlike anything seen before, and will have long-lasting consequences for Venezuela and the wider region. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
So who is the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro? Well, he was a former bus driver and union leader. He led Venezuela since 2013 following the death of his mentor, Hugo Chavez, who spearheaded a socialist government amid a hugely polarized society. In 2024, Maduro was declared president for a third term in an election widely denounced as rigged. The opposition say its leader won that election by a landslide. Donald Trump blames Maduro for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants into the US. 8 million people are estimated to have fled the country since 2013 due to the economic crisis and the government repression. Mr. Trump has also focused on fighting the influx of drugs into the US. He's alleged that Maduro is himself involved in the drug trade. Maduro denies being a cartel leader and accuses the US of using its war on drugs as an excuse to depose him and to get access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves. Well, Venezuela's Attorney General has been speaking to local media. Tarek William Saab condemned the attacks taking place in his country.
As Attorney General of the Republic, I strongly condemn the vile and cowardly attack by the imperial enemy carried out in the early hours of the morning against innocent civilian targets in our country. It shows that everything President Nicolas Maduro said about an imperial threat is now turning into bloodshed, with innocent victims mortally wounded and others killed by this criminal terrorist attack carried out in the most cowardly manner with premeditation and malice. As president of the Citizen Power, I ask that at this moment, today, January 3rd, all international organizations linked to the United Nations speak out against this vile attack.
Well, that was what we heard earlier on. Now, Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, she's one potential new leader for the country, although there's obviously a huge amount of confusion as to what happens next. My colleague Lucy Hawkins interviewed her in Oslo last month after she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She asked her about the possibility of US military intervention and what the opposition would support.
Also, President Trump has talked about the possibility of strikes on Venezuelan soil. And it is difficult sometimes with President Trump to figure out exactly what it is that he means. But is that something that you would support, a US military strike on Venezuelan soil?
Look, President Trump has offered Maduro, and he has said it publicly several times, to go through a peaceful process to dismantle the criminal structure, and has insisted that the criminal activities have to stop, which has not happened on the contrary. So we didn't want a war. We didn't look for it. The Venezuelan people want to live, in democracy and freedom, justice. It was Maduro who declared war on the Venezuelan people with state terrorism, and abroad with narco-terrorism.
But is that a reluctant yes, then, that you would support that?
What we have asked, but I've been very insistent in this, is the international community to help us stop the flows of resources, criminal resources, which are used by that regime for repression of the Venezuelan people, or innocent Venezuelans. Where those resources come from? Drug trafficking, gold trafficking, even human trafficking. And many of these resources end up in, the financial systems of democracies in Latin America or in Europe. And what we have asked is we need to cut those inflows. And a very important part of those resources come from the drug activities. So we clearly believe that an international coalition to dismantle this industry should be put in place.
Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, their Nobel Prize winner, speaking to my colleague Lucy Hawkins in Oslo. Well, Alejandro Pena Esclusa is a Venezuelan political analyst and former opposition politician who led demonstrations against the Chavez regime. He gave me his reaction to recent developments.
My reaction is that of millions of Venezuelans that are happy and grateful, because what we have with Maduro is not a government. He lost the elections last year. It's a regime that has kidnapped the country and involved too many crimes and committed many crimes against humanity. And we've come to this point that it was necessary the use of the force to liberate our country. So the people is celebrating, maybe waiting a few hours till the outcome of this is ready. But yes, people is happy for this Trump operation to liberate Venezuela and to capture this criminal who is Nicolás Maduro.
You say liberate Venezuela, but what happens next? It's very unclear, isn't it, what's going to happen to what's left of the government and where the country will go from here. What do you hope will happen next?
Well, what should happen next in a country that is basically has the same language, the same culture, and the same Christian religion. There are no divisions, and there are no economic divisions. It's not a country, let's say, like the Middle East. It's a Western Christian country, and what should happen is that the law should be obeyed. And the person who won the election last year in July of 2024, Edmundo González Urrutia, he should become president, and the vice president designated already by the president Edmundo González, Maria Corina Machado, who, as you know, is a Nobel Prize winner. She will be the vice president. This might not happen tomorrow or the day after. But that is what should happen in the next few days.
I mean,
Yes.
the opposition government, though, a lot of the opposition government have been exiled. There are opposition members in prison. How likely is it that a fractured opposition is going to get its act together in a matter of days?
Well, it is possible because most of the population, I'm talking about more than 90% of the population, didn't want anymore the regime of Maduro, having created the greatest economic and humanitarian catastrophe in the history of Latin America. So they didn't want him anymore. And people is and voted for Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. Probably what will happen also in the meantime is a fracture or division within the Venezuelan armed forces. And I believe that there's enough political and popular power to install the new government, the government that won the election on July 2024.
Is there a worry, do you think, about a violent power struggle now within the country?
No, I don't have that worry at all, because in order to have, let's say, a violent struggle or a civil war, you need a country that is divided in two parts. And that's not the case. The case in Venezuela is a few criminals that hold the arms and have been committing violations of human rights during all these years. And there's a great majority of the population who has a democratic tradition, who wants to return to democracy. I don't see a violence for, let's say, for a long period of time, maybe for a few days, but that's it.
How worried are you about the American intervention and what it means going forward? Remember, President Trump has very recently talked about Venezuelan oil and lands and about wanting it back. How worried are you that in the future, the price to pay for regime change, potential regime change, could be more US involvement in the country and more US involvement in the country's oil industry, which of course we know was nationalized in 1976?
Well, in fact, the United States and Venezuela have always had an alliance, especially in the oil business, for many decades, that was interrupted first by Hugo Chavez and then by Nicolás Maduro. So I'm sure that Venezuela and the United States will return to the alliance, business alliance in oil that we've always had, with benefits for both countries, for Venezuela and for the United States.
What do you think
the worst
should happen?
thing would have been to continue with a criminal government like the one led by Nicolás Maduro, who is also linked to the Hezbollah, to Hamas, to terrorism, and other dangerous groups that not only threaten Latin America, but also the United States and Europe.
You talked earlier on about there not being any violence, about regime change, but what about the military? I mean, does it not have a vested interest in the regime remaining in power, especially the higher up parts of the military who are intertwined with the Maduro regime?
Well, this is not an ideological armed forces. This is a corrupt military group that was corrupted first by Chavez and then by Maduro. They are not loyal to Maduro. There are many corrupt people inside the armed forces, but in the levels of majors and lieutenants and lower ranks, people just want to return to democracy and do not agree with turning the Venezuelan armed forces as an instrument of the cartel of the Suns, which is the largest drug trafficking cartels in the Western Hemisphere, responsible for distributing 20% of the cocaine in the Western Hemisphere. So military ranks, they just want to go back to normality, to democracy. So I believe that the lower ranks will make sure that the higher corrupt ranks related to the cartel of the Suns, they will just hand them over.
What do you think should happen to Nicolás Maduro now?
Well, he will face justice, and he will probably spend many years in jails because he's guilty of being the most important drug trafficker in the Western Hemisphere. Why the most important? Because he had the support of the state. This never happened in the past. In the past, you had drug traffickers in Cali, in Medellin, that they were just obtaining money for the illegal business. But in the case of Maduro, it was a political cartel that used drugs and the money coming from illegal drugs to expand the political project of Maduro, Cuba, and the left in Latin America.
What do you think the people inside the country are thinking now? Are they worried about what the future holds, or do you think there'll be an element of hope as well?
Well, if you wait a few hours, what you will, because now it's in the morning in Venezuela, it's just, the sun is just rising. But if you wait a few hours, probably what we'll see is celebrations. People hate Maduro and they want him to go. And I will tell you, even though the United States is a foreign country, the people is grateful for what's happened, and everybody is celebrating that Maduro is now being captured. I've received hundreds of calls during the last 2 or 3 hours, and people is really happy and grateful for this outcome.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more, if I can, about the opposition and the potential of the opposition to form a government. I mean, realistically, how feasible is it that a government can be formed easily when it's very well known the regime controls different branches of the government, for example, the Supreme Court, as well as the military?
Well, that part won't be easy, but it is feasible. It can be done because the opposition has the support of the population. In cases like this, when the government or the regime is corrupt and doesn't have ideological loyalties, their loyalty to the money, but not to ideas, what usually happens is a lot of people turn their backs on them. And so we will see many people from Chavismo, from the Maduro ranks, giving their backs on them, and also giving information about the leaders, and probably they will also be put in jail in short period of time. So again, in situations like this, the support and the unanimity, let's say the unique position of the population, that is 90%, 95% of the population wanting democracy, that helps things to make it easy. It's not going to be very easy, but it's going to be difficult. But with the support of the population, I'm sure it can be done.
When you talk about the people and the support of the population, I wanted to ask you specifically about what branches do you think of government will be the most difficult to bring back?
Well, the two most difficult branches will be first the armed forces, because there are some people loyal to Maduro, very few, that have arms. And with arms, it's more difficult, but I think they will also be defeated. And then the other branch that has been taken over by the regime is the judicial branch. Many judges, many people in the let's say in the judicial branch that work for Maduro and for the cartel of the Suns. So maybe some of them will flee, will escape even today, but some others will try to stay and use the Justice Department for their objectives. But again, after what happened and being Maduro captured by the U.S., they have it very difficult to remain in power.
There's been criticism and a bit of worry from foreign countries. We've had, for example, in the EU, we've had a call, Maria Callas calling for restraint and safety of EU citizens in Venezuela. How easy is it, do you think, to guarantee that there will be restraint in Venezuela? I know I asked you about violence, but situations like this can be very difficult to control.
Well, I believe the foreign people in Venezuela are much safer now than under Maduro, because Maduro was putting in jail foreign people just to use them as bargaining chips. And now that freedom will return, maybe not today, but in the few days, Venezuelans and foreign nationals will be safer. That we will see it in the next few days.
So let's just talk a little bit more deeply about the political situation in Venezuela and the repercussions internationally of that. I spoke to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, and I asked her, what's next?
This is always the big question. Every time there is a major US-led military intervention in another country, be it Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan in 2001, the big question is, what is your plan for the day after? And it's not clear to anyone whether there is a plan for the day after. What we have seen in recent months is a steady buildup of military pressure on Nicolas Maduro, on the Venezuelan authorities. They never really came clear, although it was widely assumed that this also had a political objective, and I think this is what we are seeing unfolding today. But as always, whether it's in its regime change in all but name, but as you've been discussing, will it end Chavismo? Will that end with the removal simply of President Maduro? There's still his powerful vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. There's the defense minister who's been speaking out this morning. There's the interior ministry. What happens to them? We've heard through a U.S. senator that the Secretary of State of the U.S., Marco Rubio, has said that is the end of military action for now. Is he expecting that all of these others will simply melt away? Or is this personal for the U.S.? Will they be willing to work with other officials? What about the prominent opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Maria Corina Machado? Will she expect now to go into Caracas and be the new leader? These are big questions, Marianne, most of all for the people of Venezuela, but also for the wider region. We're already getting reports that Venezuelans are now trying to stream across the border into neighboring Colombia. Colombia also already hosts many refugees, those who were critics of President Maduro. Now there's a different kind of a flow, and that is the supporters of Nicolas Maduro. So people will be holding their breath, even those who wanted to see the back of Nicolas Maduro. The concern now is what kind of a transition, if it is a transition, will there be?
And the other interesting point that I want to talk to you about, Lise, is the reverberations of this unprecedented move by the US globally. I mean, this is, action on an independent sovereign state, whatever you might think of the government, to extract a president, to remove him and his wife and take them potentially to American soil, to indict them on various charges. What is this going to mean for the global world order? What kind of anxiety and worry will this bring about within Latin America in particular?
Well, look at the reaction so far. Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, was asked for his reaction. Would he condemn U.S. military actions targeting the leader of a country, as have leading members of Parliament? And he said, no, we've got to look at the facts. Britain, as well as many other European countries, they had concerns about the illegitimate elections which brought Nicolas Maduro to power, but they would also be deeply uneasy about this military aggression and the fact that Sir Keir Starmer is saying, well, I have to talk to President Trump, I have to wait and see, although it's abundantly clear to everyone exactly what has happened in the dark of night. Similarly, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, she has also expressed what has been the broader European discontent with the rule of President Maduro, but she expressed concern for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Venezuela. So the reaction has been very mixed. You have countries, left-leaning countries in Latin America like Colombia, which have been very quick to condemn the actions. Right-wing governments, some of whose leaders have been openly backed by President Trump. They came to power in recent elections. They're not saying very much. They are watching very closely. A country like Iran, who only 24 hours ago was being threatened by President Trump with possible military action, came out very quickly and strongly condemned this blatant aggression. So it's very much a mixed picture. And I'll end by saying Russia came out and condemned the military actions of the United States. It has for decades been condemning the American penchant for regime change, but quietly the Russian leader, the Chinese president, they must all be watching closely and will no doubt see this as an affirmation of the way the New World Order works, with what are being called the strong men with their spheres of influence. The United States has its backyard in South America. Russia has, of course, its eyes on Ukraine. And just days ago, China carried out military exercises widely seen as a rehearsal for its eventual attacks on Taiwan, which it regards as an integral part of the Chinese mainland.
Ariam, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. You're with BBC News. I'm taking over for the next few hours. And just in the last few minutes, US Vice President has posted this on social media. Let's take a look. The president offered multiple off-ramps, but was very clear throughout this process that drug trafficking must stop and the stolen oil must be returned to the United States. Maduro is the newest person to find out that President Trump means what he says. Well, let's just try and get some immediate reaction to those words now. With me is our global affairs reporter, Mimi Swaby. Great to see you. So this is the latest development here, these words from the Vice President. Let's just take another quick run through them. So he's saying the President offered multiple off-ramps, but was very clear throughout this process the drug trafficking must stop, the stolen oil must be returned to the United States. Maduro is the newest person to find out President Trump means what he says. What do we make there of some of those themes that had been picked out?
Interestingly, we have heard for months now since the US started its military campaign in the region against drug trafficking that Nicolas Maduro allegedly is the head of a cartel, Cartel de los Soles, which has a key focus and a key part in drug trafficking going from Venezuela towards the US. And this has been part of these very deadly strikes we've been seeing now since early September, around 35 strikes, killing more than 110 individuals in both the South Caribbean Sea as well as the Pacific Ocean. So that's one part of that President Nicolas Maduro has been allegedly a huge role in this drug trafficking trade, which the US has said is plaguing the American soil. One part as well about the oil tankers, it has been no secret to the Venezuelan government that the US's campaign against drug trafficking was just an excuse to try and get the oil and the large reserves Venezuela has of oil in the country. And this was a guise to get regime change, as they have said, as well as access those oil reserves. And we've seen the US seize oil tankers too now, and they're still pursuing one, which we now understand has links to Russia. And this has been kind of an ongoing saga, an increasingly intensifying saga. We saw a land strike reported only recently, but the capture and removal of the disputed Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, is a whole new level. And this will shock the Venezuelan government, Venezuelan people inside and outside the country, and many US citizens alike.
Yeah, let's just pause on that, because as you brilliantly outlined there, the build-up to these various events, but the actual, if it is true, which we of course presume it is now, given the officials from the US, that these the president's wife were picked up, scooped up, and taken out of the country. How much of a surprise was that? That wasn't generally being talked about so much in the build-up.
No, I think it's come as a huge shock. This campaign has largely been, as well as military intervention and build-up we're seeing outside Venezuelan waters, a psychological war. And this increasing pressure has been, in part, to try and get Maduro to leave on his own free will. We've seen in the early hours of Saturday morning across Venezuela, including the capital Caracas, multiple strikes allegedly targeting military infrastructure. And it's now thought that those strikes were somewhat of a distraction for Delta forces by the US to swoop in, get Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and extract them, presumably heading towards the US. Now, we can only kind of presume here that this must have had some kind of inside job, knowing where Nicolas Maduro was and being able to execute this plan, which we understand has taken months to plan, would be incredibly hard. This was 90 minutes of bombardment across the country. That is a very short window to execute a pretty elaborate plan. But now we've got to ask as well, that has been seemingly done, executed, successful if you're the US. What happens the day after? I think it's deceptively simple to think now one leader has been forcibly removed from his seat in Venezuela, that another, perhaps the opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, but also the candidate opposition, Edmundo Gonzalez, who's in exile, would swoop in and assume that role. That is now what is on many people's mind, is who is going to fill this power vacuum after a incredibly shocking turn of events that happened in the early hours of Saturday morning.
Well, let's look at the possible options there then. Is there any sense that the opposition would get any kind of military support from the US, financial, infrastructure-based support, or would this be a case of, no, we've gone in, we've taken Maduro, we've charged him in the US, the rest is up to you?
That is something I think will come to light in more detail the next few hours, days perhaps, but it seems now that Maduro's inner circle, there's 4 key players here. They are all very much remaining loyal to Nicolas Maduro and have all come out publicly, shown their support and urged Venezuelans to rally against this US aggression. Now, the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, she, in theory, constitutionally, is second in line to power, and she is assuming some kind of power. We've seen her make a TV address on national state television. But then we've also got other figures at play here, just as Diosdado Cabello. He's the kind of the second-hand man. He is the Minister of Internal Affairs and very much a hardline figure when it comes to government policy. There are other figures, but the main inner circle, Maduro's very much loyal support system, are seemingly holding fort, and there may be a power struggle between them who will end up taking his role. The military are also Nicolas Maduro's greatest asset, and we haven't seen any indication thus far that they are going to turn against him. But the opposition have not made any official statement. They have said they didn't know anything about these latest operations, but again, all these details are yet to be ironed out. But for right now, people across the country are largely still very concerned about what comes next, both Nicolas Maduro supporters and opposition.
And just to underline, they are operating right now under a state of emergency, so people basically being told, stay at home.
Exactly. There is a state of commotion in force, which basically bars any citizens from leaving their homes. Now, many people probably won't want to do that anyway. One family I spoke to in the east of the country said even if they were allowed to leave, they're too scared right now. We have seen some smaller protests of Maduro supporters fill the streets of Caracas, quite a small scale from what we're seeing, but there haven't been any celebrations from Venezuelans inside the country celebrating the US's operation. Now, that is, again, due to fear, uncertainty. We know that political repression has been rife since that disputed election in 2024, and that armed civilian groups are now combing the streets under orders from the Maduro government to really squash and act upon any citizens that are celebrating this US operation.
And just briefly take us back to that election, remind us why it was so important and controversial.
So the presidential election in 2024 is widely considered by much of the international community as neither free nor fair, and many believe that Nicolas Maduro rigged the election and claimed victory when, in fact, the opposition won by a landslide. Now, Maria Corina Machado is the opposition leader, but she was barred from running, and Edmundo Gonzalez took her place and was the presidential candidate. Now, Edmundo Gonzalez is in exile in Madrid. Maria Corina Machado, now the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, left Venezuela after hiding in Caracas for many months, and we don't even know about her whereabouts just yet. But since that election, the political repression from the Maduro government has increased immensely. There have been thousands of political prisoners. We've seen some prisoner releases recently. But the repression on the streets, psychological warfare, using WhatsApp and other apps to snitch on your fellow citizens who potentially are supporting the opposition has only been increasing and creating a sense of fear and uncertainty amongst those still in Venezuela.
Mimi, thank you very much for that. We will be chatting again later on. Now, though, just let's get right up to date with all the very latest developments over the last few hours. So let's start over now. number of reports emerged of airstrikes in various locations in the South American country, around which the United States has significantly increased its military presence in recent weeks and months, of course. Then came confirmation from US President Donald Trump in a social media post confirming that the US had launched a large-scale strike on the country and that the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, had been captured and flown out of the country. Well, in the last couple of hours, the US Attorney General announced that drugs and terrorism charges against the Venezuelan leader. So let's start with the pictures from overnight. This is Caracas, showing a number of strikes of military helicopters flying over the city. According to the Venezuelan authorities, the strikes took place in 5 different areas, generally around the capital, Caracas, including a military base just on the outskirts of the capital, also the states of Miranda, other areas as well. We don't know the exact nature of the strikes at this moment. It's assumed, of course, they're targeting military installations. No word yet on casualties. So that's a brief roundup of where things are, but for a more comprehensive guide, here's our South America correspondent, Oni Wells.
Venezuela had an abrupt awakening. Its capital, Caracas, under attack from the US. Helicopters, flames, explosions. These were strikes targeting the city's key military infrastructure. Eyewitnesses woke in the early hours of the morning to the booms.
I just wake up almost at 2 a.m. in the morning with a huge bang. Everything was vibrating. I just jumped to the window and I was able to see something in flames in the middle of the runway.
Venezuelans were not just woken by the strikes, but also the news that their president, Nicolas Maduro, had been captured. On Truth Social, President Donald Trump said he and his wife had been flown out of the country after a large-scale strike against Venezuela. His government colleagues do not seem to know his whereabouts.
We demand from the Donald Trump government immediate proof of life for President Maduro and the First Lady.
There's been months of speculation about if and when the US might strike Venezuela. It has sent its biggest military deployment to the Caribbean region in decades. Thousands of troops, along with warships, planes, and helicopters. It has seized at least 2 oil tankers near Venezuela, which it says carried sanctioned oil. Venezuela accuses the US of wanting to steal its oil and resources. The US has also carried out dozens of strikes on small alleged drug trafficking boats, killing at least 110 people. It says those operations are part of a non-international armed conflict with alleged traffickers, but legal experts say they could be in violation of the laws of warfare.
They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
The US has long accused President Maduro of running a criminal trafficking network, something he strongly denies. On Thursday, Mr. Maduro said he was open to talks.
If they want to seriously discuss an agreement to combat drug trafficking, we're ready. If they want Venezuelan oil, is Venezuela ready for US investments? Like with Chevron, whenever, wherever, and however they want.
Venezuela says it will resist foreign troops. The US clearly wants regime change. That's no longer just a distant threat. Ione Wells, BBC News.
US Attorney General Pam Bondi has issued a statement on social media saying Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been indicted in the Southern District of New York. They will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts. She added, I would like to thank President Trump for having the courage to demand accountability on behalf of the American people. Well, some significant information also being posted by Senator Mike Lee of Utah on social media, saying that he spoke with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who told him in a phone call that Nicolas Maduro has been arrested by US personnel to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States. The senator also posted that the kinetic action we saw tonight was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. Well, reporting on this conversation with Marco Rubio, he said the Secretary of State, Mike Lee, he anticipates no further action in Venezuela now that Maduro is in US custody. Also commented this: the action likely falls within the president's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect US personnel from an actual or imminent attack. Well, let's speak now to our Washington correspondent, Sean Dilley. Sean, just talk us through some of the reaction we've been getting there in the US.
Well, I mean, you've given the key reaction there from the Republican Senator, Tim Lee, but I think it's just a question of people wanting clarity and answers to some of the questions. I think what we will just reiterate is exactly what Ione was saying a little while ago, is for the United States, they've long called this a non-international armed conflict. They've rejected the idea that it's any form of war or that those rules would apply. We know that there had been the sanctions placed by the Donald Trump administration over the course of last year against two organizations, one of them Cartel de los Soles, which they alleged Nicolas Maduro was leading. And we know that if we look at the timeline there, the US was alleging that this organization was involved in what they described as narco-terrorism. It's telling, isn't it, that Marco Rubio, the defense secretary, or he likes to sometimes be referred to as the Secretary for War, says that they don't anticipate any further action in Venezuela. So this is being pitched as an action taken for domestic protection. And it's interesting when you just look at the timings. Presumably at some point last night, Nicolas Maduro and his wife had gone to bed for the evening. US military had detained them. They'd flown them out of the country. We don't yet know what action, if any, would be taken against Nicolas Maduro's wife. But within hours of that, the announcement of a formal criminal proceeding starting, an indictment, which is American legal speak, essentially for, it's like a charge in most other jurisdictions where they say that they have been involved in the alleged drugs charges and possession of firearms, including machine guns. So pretty significant charges. Again, all feeding into the narrative of the Donald Trump administration here that this isn't about any international action. This is about protecting American citizens, with the Attorney General Pam Bondi insisting that President Maduro will face American justice in an American court.
Sean, thank you. Just want to bring you a couple of the lines we seem to be getting through from the agencies about Donald Trump, saying a few injuries, no deaths from our side of the Venezuela operation. This is coming to us via, as I said, news agencies. I think he's doing an interview on Fox now. So let's run you through some of these details. Donald Trump says he watched the Maduro capture live. Quote, it was like a television show. So that's the US President Donald Trump saying that he watched the Maduro capture live. It was like a TV show. They said they waited 4 days for the operation for better weather. And Donald Trump also saying he's making a decision now on what's next for the Venezuela leadership. So those new lines coming to us slightly kind of feels out of order, clearly, as this interview is going on. So we're going to just get to some more context around exactly those lines coming out of us, and we'll bring those to you when we get them. But some of the highlights so far, he's saying no deaths on our side from the Venezuela operation. He watched the capture of Nicolas Maduro live like it was a TV show. He's making a decision now on what's next for Venezuela's leadership. So these lines will continue to come through for us from that interview that Donald Trump is seemingly doing right now. We'll bring you more of those as we get them. But I'm going to bring you now some images from this morning from inside Caracas. These photos are taken from inside the Carlota military base in Caracas. They show an anti-aircraft unit that's clearly been destroyed. And you can see what appears to be substantial damage done to a bus. This is an important military base structure in the early hours of the morning. Well, the Venezuelan defense minister has been reacting to those attacks.
In the face of this cowardly attack, which threatens the peace and stability of the region, we ask the international community and multilateral organizations to condemn the US government for this flagrant violation of international rights. Venezuela is free, independent and sovereign, and strongly rejects the presence of foreign forces that have left death, sadness and destruction.
And Venezuela's Interior Minister has called for calm.
After evaluating the damages caused by the criminal and terrorist attack against our people, our patriotic ground, our electrical facilities, our revolution, and even those who aren't related to the revolution, it is an attack on Venezuela. From this beautiful people, I ask to stay calm. Trust in our leadership, trust in our military, our political leaders. During the situation we are facing, calm. No one should fall into despair. No one should make things easier for our invading enemy. After these attacks, we will win in the end. May the country win.
Well, Venezuela's Attorney General has been speaking to local media. As Attorney General of the Republic, I strongly condemn the vile and cowardly attack by the imperial enemy carried out in the early hours of the morning against innocent civilian targets in our country. It shows that everything President Nicolas Maduro said about an imperial threat is now turning into bloodshed, with innocent victims mortally wounded and others killed by this criminal terrorist attack carried out in the most cowardly manner with premeditation and malice. As President of the Citizen Power, I ask that at this moment, today, January 3rd, all international organizations linked to the United Nations speak out against this vile attack. Well, journalist Ana Vanessa Herrero is in Caracas and spoke to my colleague a little earlier.
Yes, well, right now, things are calm. I don't know if to use that word specifically, because after the strikes that happened overnight, of course, people are very still scared and nervous. And we now know from the voice of Vice President Delcy Rodriguez that she confirmed that she has no idea of the whereabouts of Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores. She did not confirm that they were taken by U.S. forces, but she did say that she has no idea, I repeat, about their whereabouts. And she also said that the instructions that Nicolás Maduro gave were very clear. If something were to happen to him, the people in arms, meaning the militia, that they've been training and the defense minister has been training for months now, should take the streets. We did see, as you were saying, we saw Diosdado Cabello, Maduro's number 2, and another person who is of most interest for to the United States. We saw him in a video on the streets, and he was saying that he was ready to, counterattack after the attack that the U.S. Performed overnight. Just recapping, this started around 2 a.m. Local time with loud bangs and explosions. I witnessed the explosions in several parts of Caracas, and immediately after, reports of every corner of Caracas, Miranda, and other states in Venezuela started flowing on social media and on WhatsApp, which is a main way of communication between Venezuelans.
And what do we know about the extent of the damage of those US airstrikes? Because a little earlier when we spoke to you, there was still darkness, but has it become clearer in the light of day?
We're still waiting for confirmation on that, on how the devastation around not only Caracas but also in the port of La Guaira, in the coastal zone of Venezuela. Right now, from where I'm standing, we cannot see clearly what happened, but we are getting some videos and pictures of how things are in different places, and it's absolute devastation. Because the Venezuelan government or authorities declared a state of commotion, which is basically a state of emergency when where all civil rights are let's say paused. We have not been able to really go to the streets yet to confirm what happened and where it happened. We're going to do that immediately after we know everything's safe for us to start reporting from the ground.
Oh, yes, because I was going to ask, you mentioned it there, the state of commotion, which is in effect a state of emergency declared. What restrictions has that brought in? How are residents affected by this?
Well, basically, people cannot leave their houses. They cannot do the regular activities. And obviously, after the night that we just witnessed and experienced, no one really wants to leave. But for example, people in need of food, water, or medicines, we don't know if they're going to be able to get to their places right now. Everyone, according to all the statements and to reports online, everyone should stay in their houses because the defense ministry said that the military took the streets of Venezuela. We don't really understand what that means. We don't know if the militarization, for example, of Caracas is going to affect, people going back and forth, for example, to hospitals, or if they are going to get some kind of permit. So right now, everything is really tense. I think the government didn't really see this coming. People really weren't prepared. So, it's only beginning. The day that started very early. Right now, it's only the sun is just shining upon Caracas again, and I think we need a couple of more hours to understand what we're dealing with.
Yes, it is, of course, early days, Anna, but one thing that would be quite useful to know, because we have been getting international reaction to this, but what has been the reaction on the ground from within Venezuela, from residents, to the news that President Maduro has been captured?
Well, this is very interesting. So, in the past, whenever something happened, for example, when the crisis of 2018, where an interim government was created after after Maduro was not recognized as a legitimate president, people were actually cheering and celebrating on the streets very quickly. But now we hear nothing. We hear silence. But internally, over phone calls, text messages, people that I'm, listening to, I'm hearing shock. They're in a state of shock, of course. They're uncertain of what's going to happen. They don't know if Maduro is out, then who is left. We did see that main characters of the Venezuelan government appeared on television. So we know that they are safe and okay. But we don't know what part they're going to play in this new reality that we're facing, that we're just starting to construct. We're just starting to build right now after this historic moment. So people are right now trying to be very careful of what they say, how they react, because they also know that Maduro gave specific instructions to armed civilians to go and catch and get anyone who would celebrate or oppose him. So I think people are being very, very cautious, and they're trying to rest. They're trying to understand what happened. It is also the shock of the night of the strike, because this is the first time, this is unprecedented for Venezuelans. At least for 200 years, we haven't had this kind of large-scale conflict. So people don't really know how to react. They're trying to accommodate to what they just experienced.
Thanks to Vanessa Herrera, speaking to my colleague just a little earlier on. So, as I mentioned, Donald Trump is speaking to the media, to Fox in the US, and we are getting a little bit more detail about the nature of this attack's decision-making behind it. So, we've recently heard that Donald Trump saying that the US won't allow anyone to take over where Maduro left off. Clearly, the question now is, given there's a power vacuum, there's a country without its president, who takes over, whether it's a succession, the deputy, the vice to step up, or the opposition to come in. One of the big questions about what does happen next, well, Donald Trump saying now, it seems, in this interview, that he won't allow anyone to just take over where Maduro left off. Also confirming, saying that there are no Americans killed in the capture operation, so the military operation to capture President Maduro and his wife. There haven't been any American casualties, according to Donald Trump. He said a couple of details now of the actual raid itself to capture the Venezuelan president, saying that US troops captured him from a fortress, and that he watched that live. He said it was like watching a television show. So there are the couple of lines. As I said, we're still getting some more through to you. We will round up with our colleague in Washington in just a moment, all those different new lines coming from Donald Trump. We're also expecting potentially to hear from him at a press conference a little later. Now, let's take you to the region itself. We've got a number of live feeds coming into us here at the BBC here in London. Let's take you first to Caracas, the center. Forgive me, this is the border of Venezuela and Colombia there. Let's take you now to Caracas, to the city center. So we have people out on the streets. Now, we were speaking to my colleague, Mimi Swaby, a little earlier, underlining the fact that there is effectively a state of emergency declared by the administration after the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And one of the conditions of that is that people stay at home. So there haven't been wild celebrations out on the streets as far as we've seen from these live pictures, but we have seen people gathering. There will clearly be many people who will just be observing the rules effectively and staying inside. Others will be fearful of heading out and demonstrating whatever way they feel. We also just want to bring you one last feed from inside Caracas there, giving you again a sense of people are out on the streets, but there will be a mixture clearly of Maduro supporters and his opponents. But we are not getting the sense that there are huge numbers out on the streets and huge celebrations. Certainly, this is a nuanced and complex picture, of course. Well, Vanessa Neumann is the former advisor to Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido. She says these strikes by the US are because the Maduro regime refused to give up power. She spoke to my colleague earlier.
Really, it's the restoration of democracy, because Maduro was due to have left the presidential palace on the 10th of January of 2025, having lost a 3-1 landslide in the elections, despite the rigging, despite the disqualification of Maria Corina Machado, then her next replacement, and then her stand-in, and Mundo Gonzalez won, because Venezuelans want out from under this tyranny. So what happens next in Venezuela is really on the heads of what the people of the Chavistas who remain, namely Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, who's a sort of this chief strategist. Delcy Rodriguez is the chief financial officer, shall we say, of the regime. The head torturer and strategist is her brother Jorge, and Diosdado Cabello and Granco. And if those people leave peacefully, as they were supposed to have done of January of last year, we really should not have civilian casualties in Venezuela. Now, the longer they try to cling to power, and when the democratic forces of Venezuela have voted them out, then this will continue to escalate and get messier. So the deaths of Venezuelans is on the heads of Maduro's enclave. It has not been forced by. It's not forced by violence. First of all, this was very much a capture operation, and it has played out exactly as I have said over at least my last 10 television interviews. They have taken out the command and control, the power to respond and attack United States forces without civilian casualties, or and doing everything possible to disrupt the illicit financial flows of illicit oil, narcotics, and to a lesser extent gold, and to respond. They have not attacked U.S. civilians, and Venezuelans have been pleading to try and get this criminal organization out, and that's exactly what they have done. They have captured a criminal, the head of the criminal organization, which is Maduro, and his wife, who are indicted, and their nephews have been tried in the United States for drug trafficking, and also they're wanted there's an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity, and as well for torture, and in the UN, they're very damning. There's 18,000 political prisoners currently being tortured just since 2018, and so they have captured a capo and taken him out. What happens with the rest of the enclave, as he should have done himself. So what happens to the rest of the enclave depends on them. There is a Venezuelan political structure that was voted by the Venezuelan people, ready to step into the presidential palace, which is what the Venezuelan people voted for in a 3-1 landslide. So it's there. There's a president, there's a vice president, there's a ministerial cabinet, there are aides, and all sorts of things. And Venezuela was, up until Chavez, the longest running democracy in Latin America.
Bringing you these latest lines from Donald Trump, as I said, doing an interview in the US to US media, and he's just been on Fox there talking about where Maduro and his wife actually are until now. Other than knowing that, according to the US, they've been taken out of the country, we haven't known their whereabouts. While Donald Trump's saying they're on a ship and says they're heading to New York. So that is the best detail we've had so far. We haven't had any evidence of that. Clearly, this is Donald Trump conducting an interview with Fox News in the US, but we'll keep across that for you. Also want to just keep you across these live pictures coming into us from Santiago. I was talking earlier about the fact that we haven't seen great scenes of celebrations on the streets of Venezuela itself, but here in Santiago, you can see the flags waving, and there have been more lively scenes of celebration there. So, saying part of the nuance here is that many people oppose the rule of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela itself, but he has been in power, and there has been a state of emergency called, and people will be, even his supporters, potentially will be fearful about coming out onto the streets. And second level of nuance, of course, is that even those who are opposed to Nicolas Maduro may well not be supportive of US action to come in, strike with airstrikes the capital, Caracas, first of all, and then secondly, take the president of Venezuela off and away, and his wife out of the country. So these are the scenes from Santiago that are a little more lively than any of the live pictures we've had in so far from Caracas and Venezuela itself. Now, Dr. Pablo Ochoa is an expert in Venezuelan military scenario planning at UCL, and spoke to my colleague earlier.
The extent of the damage now that we're trying to kind of ascertain, obviously decapitating the regime, removing Maduro from power doesn't mean that it's fallen, but we want to know about the next people who are in the hierarchy chain, right? For example, Diosdado Cabello, you haven't heard from him. We have heard from the vice president. We have heard from Padrino Lopez. But who else in the regime? I think the Venezuelan military had been under control, under severe control, since at least 2000, for the past 5 years or so. But this shows or indicates there could be a serious leak within that regime. Again, it doesn't mean that it's collapsing, but it just means there are some serious leaks that the government would have to try and find out where they are and try to counter them.
And also, I suppose the next question to ask is, will this mean that the military could start running the show?
I think it's unlikely. If anything, I think it's more likely that the military runs the show even more. I think the military in Venezuela, I've heard your guests saying that it's not an ideological military, that it's a corrupt military and so on. But one thing I think is very strong in every military is nationalism. And to have a country come into your country and remove the president and fly him out it's really damaging. I think the military is more likely to remain cohesive around the regime. And I think the emphasis on security will mean that perhaps the politics of the revolution, politics of socialism, if you will have to be in a second place in terms of importance. More important will be to ensure that the country is secure, and that means more militarization.
Now, there's been quick reaction from leaders around the world. Keir Starmer says he wants to establish the facts of what happened in Venezuela and wants to talk to President Trump. Russia called the strikes deeply concerning, while Germany says it's watching the situation with concern. Our world news correspondent Joe Inwood reports.
It's hard to overstate the significance of this moment. The strikes are the first the US has carried out in Latin America in more than 3 decades. If, as claimed, special forces have captured the Venezuelan president and his wife, it is an event without precedent. Nicolas Maduro has been in power since 2013, taking over from his mentor Hugo Chavez. He has become increasingly authoritarian, especially since retaining power in highly disputed elections. In recent months, Venezuelan forces have been on high alert, a response to the ramping up of pressure from the US. Details of the operation to capture him are still emerging, but it's being reported that Delta Force, an elite US unit, were involved.
So that's a very daring operation, but a key part of that to me, Venezuela was on alert. Being able to seize the president, fly out, to some extent, it suggests that there was a degree of internal support for the US move, and we're certainly hearing some rumours at the moment that this was a negotiated exit. The question remains negotiated with whom in Venezuela, but that this was supported to some extent by people inside the country.
The closest historical comparison is the capture of Panamanian President Manuel Noriega on this very day in 1990, the last time the US intervened militarily in the region. Like Maduro, he too had been accused of drug trafficking and faced huge military pressure. But his capture, after an 11-day holdout in the Vatican embassy, was only achieved by a full-scale ground invasion. Venezuela's allies, including Russia, have condemned today's events, while even the US's closest partners have not openly welcomed it.
I want to establish the facts first. I want to speak to President Trump. I want to speak to allies. As I say, I can be absolutely clear that we were not involved in that. And as you know, I always say and believe we should all uphold international law. But I think at this stage, fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts.
There's still much we do not know about today's events, but what we can say is that the capture of a sitting president in this way is unlike anything seen before, and will have long-lasting consequences for Venezuela and the wider region. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
And earlier, my colleague spoke to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
This is always the big question. Every time there is a major US, indeed US-led military intervention in another country, be it Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan in 2001, the big question is, what is your plan for the day after? And it's not clear to anyone whether there is a plan for the day after. What we have seen in recent months is a steady build-up of military pressure on Nicolas Maduro, on the Venezuelan authorities. They never really came clear, although it was widely assumed that this also had a political objective, and I think this is what we are seeing unfolding today. But as always, whether it's in its regime change in all but name, but as you've been discussing, will it end, Chavismo, will that end with the removal simply of President Maduro? There's still his powerful vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. There's the defense minister who's been speaking out this morning. There's the interior ministry. What happens to them? We've heard through a U.S. senator clear that the Secretary of State of the US, Marco Rubio, has said that is the end of military action for now. Is he expecting that all of these others will simply melt away? Or is this personal for the US? Will they be willing to work with other officials? What about the prominent opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Maria Corina Machado? Will she expect now to go into Caracas and be the new leader? And we're already getting reports that Venezuelans are now trying to stream across the border into neighboring Colombia. Colombia also already hosts many refugees, those who were critics of President Maduro. Now there's a different kind of a flow, and that is the supporters of Nicolas Maduro. So people will be holding their breath, even those who wanted to see the back of Nicolas Maduro. The concern now is what kind of a transition, if it is a transition, will there be?
Thanks to Lise for that. We're going to pick up on some of those themes now. We're going to speak to Brian Finucane, Senior Advisor of the International Crisis Group's US program.
Nobody really
Thanks
knows
for coming on the
what's going
program.
on.
Good to join you.
So we'll get into some of the details in just a moment. First of all, your reaction to the scale, to the significance of what's happened here.
Well, it appears to be a flagrant violation of international law, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. But it also follows the pattern, the precedent that this administration has cited of the 1989 intervention in Panama, Operation Just Cause. And today is the 36th anniversary of the capture of Manuel Noriega.
What about the plenty of opposition leaders in the country itself saying, okay, they might not have chosen this as a way of delivering a change in power here, but actually there was an election that in their eyes was stolen, and plenty of international community agree with that. They've tried protest, they've tried taking part in elections, they've tried not taking part in elections, and although this may not be the most agreeable way for it to happen, this is a way it's happened, and fundamentally it's good for the country.
Well, as we've just heard from your correspondent, what comes next is highly uncertain. So Nicolas Maduro and his wife may be in U.S. custody. That does not mean that there is going to be a smooth transition to a stable democracy in Venezuela. And frankly, it's not clear to me at all that that's even the goal of this White House. The president has cited U.S. interest, or his own interest in Venezuela's oil, alleged narco trafficking, alleged ties between Maduro and supposed terrorism, but democracy promotion does not actually appear to be this White House's objective.
Okay, let's look at some of the more detailed legal arguments here then. What's your assessment of the charges that they seem to potentially be facing, Nicolas Maduro seemed to be facing, when he arrives on U.S. soil?
So according to the U.S. Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Nicolas Maduro and his wife faced a number of charges related to drug trafficking, and somewhat amusingly also related to possession of machine guns, which is not exactly a surprise given that Maduro was the leader of a country with the military. But these U.S. criminal charges, regardless of their strength, provide no legal justification as a matter of international law for this military intervention in Venezuela.
What about the argument that this does come under presidential powers of protecting U.S. and U.S. citizens from a threat or imminent potential threat?
Well, the problem with that is that there is no threat that existed in reality. The administration has referred to Maduro as I suppose a terrorist, has alleged or suggested that somehow fentanyl is coming from Venezuela that kills Americans, which is simply not the case. And so any sort of legal justification premised on the president's authority under Article 2 is extremely weak, given the absence of any credible threat to Americans from Maduro or Venezuela.
Okay, so if in your eyes this action taken contravenes international law, there isn't a justification under those presidential powers, what could potentially be the consequences here then for the Trump administration?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I think in the first instance, the ball is now in the court of the U.S. Congress, okay, which has pushed back to some degree against military action in Venezuela before it happened, and it remains to be seen how they will respond. And I think whether or not the Trump administration engages in further actions in Venezuela may be a relevant factor there.
And in terms of the rights here of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, what kind of legal rights do they have at this moment?
So they will be afforded the protections of the U.S. criminal justice system, of due process. I think that the past precedent of the Manuel Noriega prosecution may provide some idea of how this will shake out. I think that Nicolas Maduro and his wife may assert various sorts of immunity, may raise objections to their apprehension. Those are unlikely to succeed, but I don't want to prejudge the outcome of this criminal trial. The government will have to present its evidence and have to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, let's move back to Venezuela and the question of kind of legally, constitutionally, what happens next there. Clearly, this is quite a complicated, fluid situation, but we seem to have heard from Donald Trump that he wouldn't allow effectively just someone to carry on and in the same vein as Nicolas Maduro, but it's not quite clear what that means. What ought to happen constitutionally in the country now?
Well, I won't claim to be an expert on Venezuela's constitutional law. It seems to be the case that the vice president has asserted power or assumed power. But again, if the President Trump persists with further U.S. military action in Venezuela, that could be destabilizing to whoever is currently in charge there. Again, even if there is further U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, it's far from clear that that will result in any sort of smooth transition to a stable democracy, a transition to the opposition, which claims to have won the last election.
Brian Finucane, thank you so much for coming on the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, is one of the potential new leaders of the country, although obviously huge amount of confusion as to what happens next. My colleague Lucy Hawkins interviewed her in Oslo last month after she'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. She asked her about the possibility of a US military intervention and what the opposition would support.
Also, President Trump has talked about the possibility of strikes on Venezuelan soil. And it is difficult sometimes with President Trump to figure out exactly what it is that he means. But is that something that you would support, a U.S. military strike on Venezuelan soil?
Look, President Trump has offered Maduro, and he has said it publicly several times, to go through a peaceful process to dismantle the criminal structure, and has insisted that the criminal activities have to stop, which has not happened on the country. So we didn't want a war. We didn't look for it. The Venezuelan people want to live, in democracy and freedom, justice. It was Maduro who declared a war on the Venezuelan people with state terrorism and abroad with narco-terrorism.
But is that a reluctant yes, that you would support that?
What we have asked, but I'm being very insistent in this, is the international community to help us stop the flows of resources, criminal resources, which are used by the regime for repression of the Venezuelan people or innocent Venezuelans. Where those resources come from? Drug trafficking, gold trafficking, even human trafficking. And many of these resources end up in, the financial systems of democracies in Latin America or in Europe. And what we have asked is we need to cut those inflows. And a very important part of those resources come from the drug activities. So we clearly believe that an international coalition to dismantle this industry should be put in place.
I just want to bring you some other breaking news now. Let's take you straight away live to Switzerland. This is, of course, in the aftermath of the ski resort, the fire there on New Year's Eve. We know 40
Yeah, because I would have did it. But on the actual season part, when I looked in there, I could be personally, I thought I should have seen it. I did look at that. I thought I should have seen it. got busy as hell in an hour and a half. It was literally nothing.
Next, we're going to get a little bit more reaction to events in Venezuela. The president and his wife have been taken out of the country by the US, as well as strikes there in the country. To get the reaction to it, my colleague spoke to Alejandro Pena, Esclusa, a Venezuelan political analyst.
My reaction is that of millions of Venezuelans that are happy and grateful because what we have with Maduro is not a government. He lost the elections last year. It's a regime that has kidnapped the country and involved too many crimes and committed many crimes against humanity. And we've come to this point that it was necessary the use of the force to liberate our country. So people is celebrating, maybe waiting a few hours until the outcome of this is ready. But yes, people is happy for this Trump operation to liberate Venezuela and to capture this criminal who is Nicolás Maduro. Well, what should happen next in a country that is basically has the same language, the same culture, and the same Christian religion? There are no divisions. And there are no economic divisions. It's not a country, let's say, like the Middle East. It's a Western Christian country. And what should happen is that the law should be obeyed. And the person who won the election last year in July of 2024, Edmundo González Urrutia, he should become president. And the vice president designated already by the president, Edmundo González, Maria Corina Machado, who, as you know, is a Nobel Prize winner, she will be the vice president.
Right, I just want to bring you now this interview that President Trump, he's been speaking to Fox News. We've been bringing you various lines of exactly what has been happening. So we will be bringing you that shortly. But right now, let's go back to Switzerland because we understand the prosecutor is speaking in English. Let's listen.
He's like, yeah, T-Neck, you got it, you got it. I'm like, shit, this only an hour and a half. Like, I didn't think about this.
America and giving them an update on what happened. Let's listen.
What they did is really amazing, and I think it sends the signal. We're not going to be pushed around as a country anymore by these countries where we want to be politically correct all the time. They're killing our people. If we had a war, if you lost 300,000 people in the Civil War, we lost 600,000 people. We lose 300,000 people a year to drugs, and we're not going to allow it anymore with any country.
Right.
The president also gave an update on the whereabouts of Nicolás Maduro and his wife.
Well, they'll be heading to New York. You know, they were indicted in New York, and also.
So, are they taken to a ship first, and then?
Yes, to Iwo Jima. They're on a ship, but they'll be heading into New York. The helicopters took them out, and they went by helicopter in a nice flight. I'm sure they loved it. But they've killed a lot of people. Remember that they killed a lot of people, and
A lot of Americans.
even people in their own country. They killed a lot of people to maintain power. He's a very vicious person.
Well, let's go straight to Washington, get a bit of reaction to that. Our correspondent, Sean Dilley, is there. Hi, Sean. Just talk us through what stood out for you there.
Well, I mean, obviously the key clips we've just heard, but he did liken watching the events unfolding remotely of US Special Forces making the capture like a television show, and I think that's because of the action that was involved. As we've heard, he had said that the capture was from a fortress-like house. To repeat there, he said that Maduro and his wife were then taken, or they were loaded onto a ship, the Irajima, which is bound for New York. And that's significant because whilst there is and there will be debate as to whether this was some kind of international conflict, the US has always insisted that it's actually a non-international armed conflict, and that the jurisdiction now dealing with this is US domestic authorities, whereas we very much are aware of special forces using very heavy armaments and helicopters, which President Trump said President Maduro had a ride on, to use his words. We do know that this is now destined for a courtroom inside the United States. Already a criminal indictment for President Maduro and his wife. But it was striking that he was asked about what was described as an off-ramp by the Fox News hosts who were interviewing Donald Trump by telephone. He said, yes, he had that opportunity. He was told he'd need to give up and surrender. Now, that obviously didn't happen. President Trump repeated his lines about alleged drug boats, claiming that the transportation of drugs across the waters had reduced by, he said, 97%. We haven't verified any of those figures independently as the BBC, but he said that the transportation has virtually stopped. And again, just repeating the actions against Venezuela, he is saying, was to protect Americans inside America.
And he said that line that will stand out, Sean, I'm sure, to some people, saying, quote, literally, like I was watching a television show. He was talking about watching the overnight capture of Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, that was the first thing I said at the answer, because that's what struck me the most. He was watching it remotely. He said it was like watching a television show. And again, I'm aware I'm slightly repeating myself, but it's because presumably of the action that he was watching that was unfolding, and the I guess attack on a fortress-like house as US Special Forces entered. Now, although we don't really know much of the detail of that operation, we do know from history, we do know from previous presidents exactly what unfolds in these types of situations. President Trump wouldn't be drawn on which military special forces were involved, but we remember those very famous interviews with former President Obama, for example, talking about the capture of Osama bin Laden. A very different situation to that of President Maduro, of course, but being able to watch blow-by-blow accounts of what's happening in real time. So President Trump would have had a front seat view of what was happening. He obviously would have been expecting this to happen. He is the commander-in-chief in the United States. And, again, there are debates internationally about what may be the rights and wrongs of the situation, and we are at a very early stage. But it is the case when any special forces anywhere around the world operate, the scenes are pretty spectacular because of the equipment they have to use to penetrate, in this case, what President Trump says was like a fortress.
Okay, Sean, let's look at now potentially what happens next, because Donald Trump was asked about that, whether he will be supporting the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. What are some of the decisions, and what do we hear from Donald Trump about what kind of decision-making could be happening next?
Yeah, it's a really important question. That he said that Washington would not just walk away, that he said the US would be very involved in what happened next. It was put to him, but that there would still be people who would be loyal to President Maduro. I mean, in the here and now, of course, it's the case that he is still the president of Venezuela, even if America might take a different view on that. So he was asked, what if people are loyal to President Maduro? And President Trump said, well, if they remain loyal to him, the future is going to look very bad for them. So what might it look like? Well, I mean, it's really interesting because the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in the United States says he doesn't anticipate any further action in relation to the captures and the actions that have taken place on Venezuela's soil. But what happens now is debate about the legality of this operation. Just to be very, very clear, because there are an awful lot of lines coming out, including the French foreign minister within the last few moments, criticising the operation, saying it goes against every aspect of international law. America's position is different to that. They take the view, and actually you can look back to President Monroe and something called the Monroe Principles in the early 19th century. America takes the view that if something happens in its backyard, or if there are any interferences in what they would regard to be domestic and political affairs, that America claims it has the jurisdiction to deal with that. Now, it is going to be interesting how that is viewed by the international community. It was interesting to hear the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, being asked about this, saying, well, look, UK forces weren't involved in this, but we would like to know all of the details. So what will happen next? There's an awful lot of questions from the international community. I would expect President Trump to be fairly robust. He said to Fox News not that long ago that he was, I paraphrase slightly, he didn't use the word disappointed, but he said he was disappointed by people saying, well, maybe it wasn't constitutional. They are big questions, though.
Sean, just want to bring you, because you were talking about you very rightly clarifying some of the legal claims and counterclaims. Just want to bring you, as we've been chatting, from South Africa has called for an urgent United Nations Security Council session following the unilateral military action by the US in Venezuela. They've released a statement saying South Africa calls on the UN Security Council, the body mandated to maintain international peace and security, to urgently convene to address the situation, their statement saying, and also hearing from the Secretary General saying deeply alarmed by the recent escalation in Venezuela. So those issues of international law, classification, jurisdiction, and these actions will have international consequences, sure.
Yes, but it's no great surprise. And, we have been here before. It's not like the first time. This is the first time the US has taken such action. We look at Panama in 1989 and indictments in 1990. Again, allegations of, drug transportation. So it's a well-trodden path in many regards. And it goes to underline the conflict that does exist, where the United States would claim to have jurisdiction pretty much anywhere, actually, where it impacts US citizens, and the principles of international law, and what the legal basis was. But I'm going to make this point: this would be equally applicable to any international action, as it would to any criminal case in any courts around the world. Is the law is an incredibly complex thing with so many principles, and while one lawyer would happily advocate for one party that the law says X, another lawyer is going to argue completely the inverse of that. So we're going to see some of that play out, and there will be, absolutely, there already has been condemnation of the US's actions, and the US will robustly say that it was protecting Americans. The claim that President Trump puts on it, and again, certainly not verified by the BBC here, but he says that every one of the drug boats they've targeted off the coast of Venezuela is responsible for 25,000 US lives. It's not really clear where he gets that 25,000 US lives from, but the arguments have been set out over the last year. President Trump's been incredibly careful with the language that he's using, and I almost want people to go back, take a look at some of those words, and you'll see a consistent theme in every word he's been speaking. Since coming back to the White House, he has held off doing what he did in his first term and saying that he wanted a new leader in Venezuela. Regime change is obviously not legally, generally speaking, recognised to be a legitimate purpose to pursue. But everything he's been saying has been couched within the danger he says that was faced by American people, not just by the use of drugs and the consumption of drugs that are transported, but he says the criminal activity of two organizations which he designated as foreign terrorist organizations. One of them, Cartel de los Soles, he alleges was run by the president of Venezuela. So it's going to get particularly mucky, and the arguments are going to be on the international front. Well, hang on a minute, where was your international authority? And America will robustly say, well, this isn't an international issue. This is what they call, again, the words are important here, what they call an international, non-international, armed conflict. Now, it all gets very confusing. That's probably going to be the debate that happens next.
Okay, and Sean, just because it's clearly related, the critics of this action will say this is related to oil. and oil in Venezuela. Just talk us through what are the issues and the arguments. Why is oil a factor here potentially?
Yeah, so we'll look at both. We'll look at both sides of the coin, because oil, the United States would say yes, that absolutely is a factor, but the dispute would be around that motivation. President Maduro and those close to him have said that this is clearly a US attempt to enrich the United States through the resources and the vast wealth that Venezuela has built up. And the US, on the counter side and the other side of that coin, say, yes, we do want to stop the trade in illicit oil and sanctioned oil, which they are alleging has been used to fund what they call narco-terrorist groups. They've spoken about using counter-terror powers in the same way, or counter-terror techniques that they used against terrorist organizations historically, such as Al-Qaeda, to stop any illicit revenue going to what they describe as narco-terrorists. Now, of course, people have questioned President Trump's motivations and the United States. Of course, there are questions as to how much of this is down to a domestic issue and how much is this down to historical dislike between the two individuals. But it absolutely is the case that America wouldn't deny that there is an issue around oil. The question is, what is that motivation? And that is, what people are finding their own answers to, I suppose.
Sean, thank you so much for setting out some of the broader context there. Appreciate that. Right now, we're just going to take a run through of some of the live pictures we have coming into us here. This is Caracas, just gone 11 a.m. there. You can see some flags, well, a flag waving. It has been a relatively restrained so far, the images we have seen. There is technically a state of emergency imposed, which means people aren't supposedly being allowed out of their houses. People are staying at home, but there have been some gatherings of people here, as you can see. We've also got some other live pictures running into us here from the border. Let's take a look at these. This is the Colombia-Venezuela border there that we've just been keeping an eye on over the last couple of hours. And we can also head to Santiago. So I said there are not much enthusiastic people out on the streets in Venezuela itself, but a little bit different there in Santiago. You can see, just gone midday there, much more flags and people out and about celebrating the toppling of Nicolas Maduro there in a way that we haven't seen so much in Caracas, in Venezuela itself, potentially because of the confusion and uncertainty, and of course the fact that it was struck by US military operations overnight. Another live feed to bring you, just to kind of mark your card, what we are expecting a bit later. We are expecting to hear from Donald Trump, US President, a little bit later. It is just gone 10 a.m. in the morning in Washington. He is in Florida, and we're expecting a press conference or him to be speaking at some point in the next couple of hours. There's always a bit of a health warning with timings for press conferences and media appearances. Of course, there's never exact timings, but you can see there people out and about in Florida as well. So they're just a taste of some of the live pictures we have coming into us here at the BBC in central London. We'll be keeping across all of those for you in the hours ahead, and especially in the build-up potentially to those words from Donald Trump. Let's take you now to what happened overnight and those dramatic pictures of those strikes. So a number of airstrikes hitting various parts of Caracas. Let's take a look at some of those pictures now. These are the early hours of the morning. Number of strikes, helicopters flying over the city as well. And according to the Venezuelan government, at least, there were strikes in 5 different areas, generally around Caracas, including a military base on the outskirts of the capital. And there were also strikes in surrounding areas as well. Don't know exact nature of the strikes. Assumed to be military installations. Some reporting from the US that they effectively were a distraction from the extraction operation of the president and his wife. No word on casualties. Donald Trump saying there were no US fatalities in the operation. But we are waiting any more details from Venezuela itself, but we don't actually have any reports of any fatalities there. Right, just to bring you up to speed with those pictures from overnight and just remind you of what we are looking forward to. We're going to try and take a moment to look at the words specifically of Donald Trump. He's been speaking to Fox News, so let's see if we can take a quick look at that.
What they did is really amazing, and I think it sends a signal. We're not going to be pushed around as a country anymore by these countries where we want to be politically correct all the time. They're killing our people. If we had a war, if you lost 300,000 people in the Civil War, we lost 600,000 people. We lose 300,000 people a year to drugs, and we're not going to allow it anymore with any country.
And we also got another little snippet of what Donald Trump said. Let's listen.
Well, they'll be heading to New York. You know, they were indicted in New York, and also.
So were they taken to a ship first, and then?
Yes, to Iwo Jima. They're on a ship, but they'll be heading into New York. The helicopters took them out. They went by helicopter in a nice flight. I'm sure they loved it. But they've killed a lot of people. Remember that they killed a lot of people, and
a lot of Americans.
even people in their own country. They killed a lot of people to maintain power. He's a very vicious person.
So they're the first interview done by the president to Fox News, as you saw. They're giving us some new details about the operation, saying he watched it on a live feed, effectively describing the president's fortress, and they're clearly describing the fact that he's now on a ship on his way to New York. Well, before we heard from Donald Trump, we heard from various figures within Venezuela reacting to the attacks themselves. First, let's hear from the Venezuelan defense minister.
In the face of this cowardly attack, which threatens the peace and stability of the region, we ask the international community and multilateral organizations to condemn the US government for this flagrant violation of international rights. Venezuela is free, independent and sovereign, and strongly rejects the presence of foreign forces that have left death, sadness and destruction.
And then we heard from the Interior Minister calling for calm.
After evaluating the damages caused by the criminal and terrorist attack against our people, our patriotic ground, our electrical facilities, our revolution, and even those who aren't related to the revolution, it is an attack on Venezuela. From this beautiful people, I ask to stay calm, trust in our leadership, trust in our military, our political leaders during the situation we are facing. Calm. No one should fall into despair. No one should make things easier for our invading enemy. After these attacks, we will win in the end. May the country win.
And lastly, just want to bring you what we heard from Venezuela's Attorney General.
As Attorney General of the Republic, I strongly condemn the vile and cowardly attack by the imperial enemy carried out in the early hours of the morning against innocent civilian targets in our country. It shows that everything President Nicolas Maduro said about an imperial threat is now turning into bloodshed, with innocent victims mortally wounded and others killed by this criminal terrorist attack carried out in the most cowardly manner with premeditation and malice. As President of the Citizen Power, I ask that at this moment, today, January 3rd, all international organizations linked to the United Nations speak out against this vile attack.
So that's some of the reaction there from within Venezuela in the aftermath of those strikes in the early hours of the morning. Since then, in the hours since then, we've been getting plenty more reaction, as you'd expect, including recently, just in the last hour or so, from the UN Secretary General's spokesperson. We have that as a statement. Let's take a quick look at the words here. The Secretary General is deeply alarmed by the recent escalation in Venezuela, culminating in today's United States military action in the country, which has potential worrying implications for the region. Independently of the situation in Venezuela, these developments constitute a dangerous precedent. Later going on, Secretary General added in that statement his concerns of the rules of international law had not been respected. So there are continued concerns about international law and precedent here. Let's speak to our global affairs reporter, Mimi Swaby. So, Mimi, good to see you again. So the way in which these strikes and attacks were carried out will now clearly be part of many international organizations, including the United Nations, investigations into how this happened. But it's worth reflecting just how extraordinary it is for effectively the US to go in and remove physically the president and the president's wife from a different country.
Yes, this can't be overstated. This kind of harks back to the gunboat diplomacy era of the US, when the US would go into country, meddle, and basically topple a regime it seemed unfit to govern. And with that brings a lot of concern for the region. US interventions historically in Latin America have not gone down well. They have been extremely bloody and had large repercussions for the countries itself and the wider region. Even the US military buildup just off Venezuelan waters now, around 15,000 troops alongside the world's largest warship. That is considerably bigger than the buildup there was outside of Panama before the US invaded nearly 4 decades ago, to give a sense of the urgency and the scale of this operation. And that is well before we've come to the latest developments on early Saturday morning, which involved the Delta Force swooping in under the guise of explosions across numerous areas of Venezuela. In Caracas, I've had people tell me the sound echoed around the city. It's in a valley, so that created a tremendous thundering sound, which awoke many Venezuelans confused and startled, and now getting to grips with a momentous operation, which the US has heralded as a brilliant success.
We, of course, covered this in the build-up. We talked about that build-up of military in and around the country, and there were plenty of questions about how any kind of ground or land military operations by the US in Venezuela would actually work, and there were lots of analysis about the potential risks of that. It wasn't a big topic of conversation in the lead up to these strikes, that actually they would just go in, just to take the president, extract with his wife, get out of there, and then try them on US soil. That wasn't one of the major talking points in the build up to it. So it must have been clearly a shocking development.
It's taken everybody by shock, I think. There are nearly 8 million Venezuelans who have fled the country since Nicolas Maduro first took power back in 2013, largely due to political repression alongside economic sanctions. And many of whom have been urging this to happen, kind of backing US military intervention, many people looking for the removal of power of Nicolas Maduro. However, Nicolas Maduro has seen this building aggression, land strike recently, numerous strikes on vessels allegedly carrying drugs from Venezuela to the US. We know that more than 110 people have been killed since early September. But much of this was thought to be psychological warfare. And Maduro's tactic had been to hunker down and kind of withstand. And he'd come out numerous occasions trying to really unite Venezuelans and say, we will stand against this US aggression. This drug trafficking operation is just an excuse for the US to seize Venezuelan oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, as well as remove Nicolas Maduro from power, perhaps ultimately trying to put the opposition, led by Maria Corina, the leader of that party, but the candidate, Eduardo Gonzalez, into his seat. There is a lot of confusion about what is happening, what will happen next, but nobody, I think, saw this coming. And it really has blindsided many in and outside the country. We're not seeing a huge amount of celebrations from those against Nicolas Maduro in the country. However, outside, the large diaspora really are some celebrating on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on exactly that point, because we've been rolling through some of the live pictures we have here coming into us and trying to basically put a bit of context and a bit of explanation about what we've been seeing. So first of all, this is Santiago. The picture quality not great just at this moment, as you can see. But yeah, just talk us through the contrast with people out with the flags there in Santiago, whereas in Caracas, it feels to be much more subdued and in a way a lot smaller numbers. Just talk us through the nuance there.
Definitely. So firstly, there is a state of commotion in place. That is basically a state of emergency. And a part of that means that citizens aren't allowed to leave their homes. We've seen a few protests in favor of Nicolas Maduro on the streets of Caracas and other cities, but we haven't seen any large-scale celebrations. Very different scenes to we're seeing in Chile, Miami, Madrid, other cities where there are large numbers of Venezuelans who have fled the country and settled in those areas. We understand that there are now armed civilian groups who, under the order of the Maduro government, are somewhat combing the streets to squash and act upon any individuals in the country who are celebrating the US's operation. So very different scenes here, but largely the streets of Caracas and much of Venezuela will remain quiet as the level of fear and uncertainty from both parties is rife. We have seen some reports that individuals who support Nicolas Maduro make their way to the Colombian border to try and flee the country, but largely still a very quiet morning in the city.
Okay, Mimi, just stay there one moment. I just want to bring you, just we should say as well, yeah, these pictures there, we've been keeping crossing Caracas over the last couple of hours. There are more people there, certainly over the last couple of hours, but still not huge numbers, as you were saying. Mimi, just want to get your thoughts on this. We've just heard from, on social media now, in the last few minutes, from US Speaker Mike Johnson. Just want to pull out a couple of this, saying today's military action was decisive and a justified operation that will protect American lives. Nicolas Maduro is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans after years of trafficking illegal drugs and violent cartel members into our country, crimes for which he's been properly indicted in US courts and an arrest warrant duly issued. Today, he learned what accountability looks like. President Trump is putting American lives first, succeeding where others have failed, and under his leadership, the United States will no longer allow criminal regimes to profit from wreaking havoc and destruction on our country. Trump administration is working to schedule briefings for members of Congress as it returns to Washington next week. So just that line there, that Nicolas Maduro is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans after years of trafficking illegal drugs and violent cartel members into our country. Could you just talk us through what is meant by that?
So this is a line that the Trump administration has been pushing increasingly now, that Nicolas Maduro is not just involved in drug trafficking, but actually heads a cartel, Cartel de los Soles, which plays a key role in trafficking and organizing the movement of cocaine from Venezuela to the US. Now, Cartel de los Soles has military roots, according to those who believe it's true and actually exists to start with. The Soles means sons, and the sun is a symbol of the Venezuelan military, kind of inferring the rank of the commanders or soldiers. Some say this cartel is completely made up. Others believe it has a forefront role in trafficking drugs, such as the US is saying. The truth seems to appear somewhat in the middle. But the Venezuelan government, Nicolas Maduro, has firmly repelled this statement, saying he has nothing to do with drug trafficking, and this cartel is completely fabricated, again, with the US using this excuse to actually seek regime change, as well as access Venezuela's very large reserves of oil and other minerals. There is drug trafficking through Venezuela, and there is no doubt that some of the military has a foot in the door in some sense, but comparatively, compared to Colombia and Mexico, it has a very small part in this global trade. It's thought now that about 70% of the world's cocaine flows through Ecuador on the other side of the continent. So this can't all be put down to drug trafficking. And we know now that regime change and oil, we've just heard President Trump say that the US is going to have a large involvement in Venezuela's oil industry. Those are true motives which appear to be coming to light with more prevalence.
Thank you very much for that. We'll be chatting to you again later on. Thank you for that. Well, Vanessa Neumann is a former advisor to Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido. She spoke to my colleague a little earlier.
Really, it's the restoration of democracy, because Maduro was due to have left the presidential palace on the 10th of January of 2025, having lost a 3-1 landslide in the elections, despite the rigging, despite the disqualification of Maria Corina Machado, then her next replacement, and then her stand-in, and Mugo Gonzalez won, because Venezuelans want out from under this tyranny. So what happens next in Venezuela is really on the heads of what the people of the Chavistas who remain, namely Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, who's a sort of this chief strategist. Delcy Rodriguez is the chief financial officer, shall we say, of the regime. The head torturer and strategist is her brother Jorge, and Diosdado Cabello and Granco. And if those people leave peacefully, as they were supposed to have done in January of last year, we really should not have civilian casualties in Venezuela. Now, the longer they try to cling to power, and when the democratic forces of Venezuela have voted them out, then this will continue to escalate and get messier. So the deaths of Venezuelans is on the heads of Maduro's enclave. It has not been forced by violence. First of all, this was very much a capture operation, and it has played out exactly as I have said over at least my last 10 television interviews. They have taken out the command and control, the power to respond and attack United States forces without civilian casualties, doing everything possible to disrupt the illicit financial flows of illicit oil,
you want to go outside?
Oil, narcotics,
to a
lesser extent gold, and to
respond,
if not attack civilians. And Venezuelans have been pleading to try and get this criminal organization out. That's exactly what they have done. They have captured a criminal, the head of the criminal organization, which is Maduro, and his wife, who are indicted, and their nephews have been tried in the United States for drug trafficking, and also they're wanted has an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity, and as well for torture, and in the UN, they're very damning. There's 18,000 political prisoners currently being tortured just since 2018. And so they have captured Acampo and taken him out. What happens with the rest of the enclave?
Not going to be at the house.
As he should have done
You're
himself.
going to be
So
in the
what happens to the rest of the enclave depends on them. There is a Venezuelan political structure that was voted by the Venezuelan people, ready to step into the presidential palace, which is what the Venezuelan people voted for in a 3-1 landslide.
You can't go to the house.
So it's there. There's a president, there's a vice president, there's a ministerial cabinet, there are aides, and all sorts of things. And Venezuela was, up until Chavez, the longest running democracy in Latin America.
You too.
Just want to bring you some reaction from the Shadow Foreign Secretary Sal here in the UK, saying this: no people shed tears about Maduro's removal, but called it, quote, very serious geopolitical moment.